Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 134, Modern Web APIs. I am one of your hosts this week, Justin Barrow, and join me, as usual, Mr. Leon Revel.
Hello, everybody.
And Miss Amal Hussain, who I believe is muted.
I am muted. Sorry. Hi, everyone.
And before we introduce our guest today to talk about modern web APIs, we're going to throw it over to the news desk to Mr. Leon, who's going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less.
Thank you, Justin. So the first one is a big one. Service Worker has moved into the development phase in WebKit. AxeCore, the accessibility testing engine, now supports ShadowDOM. FireFox 55, which was released last week, includes Windows support for WebVR. React Day Berlin, which is happening on the 2nd of December, is now accepting talk proposals. Chrome Beta 61 is now available, including some awesome features such as JavaScript modules, WebShare, which we'll be talking about soon, and WebUSB. Safari Technology Preview Release 37 is now available with initial support for sendBeacon, among some other things. And the Chrome team has just released Puppeteer, a modern Node API for controlling headless Chrome. And that's everything from me from this week.
Oh, sorry, Leon. I'm dabbing away tears because you said Service Worker and Safari in the same sentence, and the word development came up. So I apologize. Thank you so much for that 2 minutes or less of News Week Web things. Thank you, Leon. That was possibly my smoothest transition ever. But today, speaking of transitions, let's talk about modern web APIs. Our guest this week probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to have him introduce himself anyway. Mr. Paul Kinlan. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you. I actually normally do need an introduction because everyone always thinks I was either Paul Lewis or someone else. So, yeah, I'm Paul Kinlan. I lead our web developer relations team and our Chrome developer relations team at Google. And I kind of play around with the latest new APIs coming on the platform and trying to work out, you know how developers can use them and how we can get feedback and how we can kind of just get excitement in the industry around them. So yeah, that's me.
And you've been around the web for a long time, Paul. I feel like I've run into you since the beginning of the web, it feels like. How did you originally get started on the web? I'm always curious to know here on the show, like how people the web, it's there, and now I'm there too, writing APIs and such.
That's actually quite a funny story. I remember the first time I actually went on the web, and it was with my friend Rob Knowles, and we went to Liverpool, and we went to an internet cafe, and we saw a browser there. We were like, cool, load the browser up. And we're like, well, what do we do? We went, I don't know. Where do we go? I don't know. Who's got a website? I don't know, CNN. So we spent about half an hour. We spent all of our money and literally just went to CNN.com at the time. But that was the thing that got me kind of interested in the web platform and how you actually build things on the web. And I've been kind of doing everything ever since. So I've kind of, run a couple of companies in the past that have been kind of web development agencies and hosting companies. And how I got into this role was that I was building software on App Engine and on the web. And then that came to the notice of Google. And then I kind of got morphed into the Chrome team and a whole bunch of other things at that point. So I've been probably building on the web for, I don't know, since I want to say 2000 at least, maybe a little bit before. But yeah, it's only the last 7 or 8 years where I've been doing really deep kind of new APIs and trying to work out how we push the platform forwards quite a lot. I think Web Intents, I always mention Web Intents, by the way, have to get it in, was one of the first things that I kind of really start to try and push the platform on in terms of IPC and interop and communication between applications and sites and stuff. So that's a long way of saying how I got on the web, but it all started with CNN. So hey,
very fake news or an organization, I'm told, but a good way to start nonetheless. I mean, and you talk about Web Intents, which I was around when you released Web Intents as a spec, and it holds a place in my heart as well, as because it was so forward in the scope of things. Because it really came out when, there was APIs coming, but we didn't have a lot of new fanciness still there quite yet. Yeah. And the web API sort of platform has seen an explosion of growth. across a wide range of APIs these days.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking at it as I don't like the idea of web apps being kind of silos. It's like really hard to get data in and out of applications and sites on the web. And then and I see it still today. Like we're adding a lot of new APIs onto the web platform, which is cool. And we'll talk about some of them today. But I still worry, it's actually hard. It's hard to drag a file out of the browser onto the desktop. It's hard to drag data between two windows, two different kind of websites. It's really hard to kind of have a consistent message channel between the kind of two browsers or two instances of the browser and the window and a service worker and the web workers. And the APIs exist. We just don't know how to articulate kind of, how to actually start the session off, how to discover applications, how to discover services and, all that type of stuff. So I'm still kind of passionate about that area. I think we'll talk about it in a bit, but WebShare is a kind of a start at kind of leveling some of the playing field of making sure that websites are wherever the user is on the system, whether it's on a native app or a desktop or set coming from the native app back into the web and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I just want the web to be everywhere, kind of where the user is. And that also kind of precludes some of these brand new APIs that are coming through, like WebUSB and generic sensor API and all these other things. We should have access to them, and we can enable that for every user, every developer as well.
That's really interesting, Paul. So I was wondering if you could just further try to summarize this, in even maybe lay terms, what problem does WebShare kind of solve? What immediate problems does it solve? And I think what are some problems that it could solve longer term, right?
Yeah. It's a good question. So I think this kind of gets back to a point I was trying to say before about drag and drop is really hard. Getting data out of your website onto the user's operating system is it's nearly impossible to do. And WebShare, the WebShare API is kind of, it's kind of, I don't want to say it breaks out of the web into native to some extent, because that's the wrong way of kind of thinking about it. But it allows us to make sure that, if we've got some content and we want to share it in the native Facebook app, or we want to share it in our kind of inbox or Gmail app, we don't have to just fake it just on the web. We just have the ability to kind of call one little API and make sure that the data that we've generated on the web and have in the web, we can kind of integrate with third-party applications on the user's system at that point. I think the broader question is, at the moment, it goes from website to native app. So it looks like we're kind of losing data from the web, and it looks like we're kind of taking data and saying it's kind of great on the web, but actually we want to have it in this native app space. I think the longer term thing of where we want to try and get to is, the web is a full participant in all of these ecosystems and all these platforms. And we can have a web app be in the native Android picker. So when you share something from, I'm trying to think now of a good example. What good apps are there on Android? Gmail, right? You've got something in Gmail and you want to share it out to someone on Twitter, but you don't have the Twitter app. You've got the Twitter website. How do you actually do that without encoding twitter.com into the kind of into the operating system and a whole bunch of other stuff? And I think that's where we want to try and get to is the web is in every single service that the user touches on their native device, or then kind of on their device, whether it's a custom integration kind of to receive data, or another integration like WebShare to send data out to an application or to another website at that point. So I think the Share API, it has the potential to kind of bridge those gaps between native, web to native, native to web to web kind of communications.
Yeah, because in native applications, we've kind of nearly got this nailed. It's so easy to transfer information between different apps all the time natively. So it sounds like the idea is to make this more possible in standard web applications. So for those people who aren't familiar with the WebShare API, I mean it's relatively new. I mean, I'm not that particularly familiar with it. Could you describe kind of how it works from a user's perspective and then how it works from a developer's perspective?
Yeah, sure. So from the user perspective. Actually, it's an interesting question. So if you're in Chrome, the normal way of sharing the current URL or some data is you click on Chrome on Android. You click on the little hamburger menu or the three buttons at the top right of the screen. It drops down a menu and you press share, and then it opens up this kind of, they call it like a native sheet, and the sheet has a list of all the applications that you've got on your system that can accept a share and accept data from another application that is sharing information. And then potentially it also includes kind of information about like regular contacts, and so like I might kind of send SMS messages to my son. So my son will appear in like the little picker inside inside the latest version of Android, so that I could send just a message straight to him with that kind of information in. And that's the native app. That's the Chrome of Chrome actually kind of owning that entire experience. And the Navigator Share API, or the Share API in particular, what it's decided to do is like it gives you as the developer a little bit more control about how you can kind of invoke that native sheet. Like the thing that you've got from the Chrome of Chrome to load the share, like do a share, that is now available to every single developer. So like if you're in, say, the Twitter application, the Twitter Progressive Web application, if you're inside a tweet, you can click a little options button, and then you can like see some of the menu items. And one of those items is share, so that you can then share the URL out into another native application at this point. So I think from the user perspective, you just see like a thing like share. The idea behind it is that it should remove like all the little buttons that we see inside every single website from a user perspective. So you don't need share to Facebook, you don't need a share to WhatsApp, you don't need a share to Twitter, kind of logos and pulling in all those libraries and all that other stuff. You've now just got one kind of simple share action, which allows you to get access to that entire ecosystem. But with I don't know, maybe 150 characters worth of code versus having to pull in kind of reams and reams and reams of JavaScript. So from the user perspective, it should be a cleaner experience. It should be a more performant experience. From a user perspective, a full screen progressive web application at the moment in Chrome doesn't have any way of accessing the URL, which is a common kind of complaint, and we still need to deal with that. So like you've got no access to the ability to kind of do the native kind of share inside Chrome. So you now get the ability to kind of inside your application offer that up to users as well. And then from developers, it's simplicity. The idea is that if you've got access to the API, you don't need to pull in all this kind of extra code and extra widgets to be able to manage that share sheet.
You mentioned Twitter, Paul, and as I recall, when Twitter released Twitter Lite, their progressive web app version of Twitter, it actually had the WebShare API in it before WebShare landed, and I believe that's through the origin trial sort of way that you can test features on the web before they've really widely available. A lot of people don't know about this. I know we were talking about this, just about before the show. We talked a little bit about this. Maybe we should talk about origin trials. Like, what are they particularly? Like, if you're a developer, like, why should you care about origin trials? Because everyone seemed to really notice Twitter had the really cool share API, and then I feel like everyone really wanted the share API after that.
Yeah. That's actually a really good question. The way I look at it is that an origin trial is based off this conversation that Alex Russell started about trying to do science on the web at scale, but without trying to break the web. And like the idea behind it is not to blame WebKit, but like we've kind of had this history of kind of custom prefixes, whether it's a Mozilla prefix or a WebKit prefix, to be able to kind of integrate, say, styling or kind of new APIs onto the platform that we potentially know are only going to work in that one browser. So like the prefix on that API kind of indicates that actually this is probably experimental. You've got kind of like this implied contract between the developer and the browser or the user agent at this point in terms of, this API might not be ready for prime time. But the problem is that a lot of these APIs are actually really quite useful, and developers want to be able to kind of get access to it, and then they kind of like more developers use it as more developers talk about these kind of features, and then all of a sudden it kind of becomes uncontrollable. And like there isn't a very clean way of being able to kind of bring a new API like the share API, for instance, onto the web without kind of having it deployed across every single user of Chrome or every single user of Safari and all these other things. And the idea behind it is we're trying to be a little bit more principled about how we can get an API, this is for us into Chrome, so that we can test it, we can get feedback from developers, we can test it with relatively large developers like Twitter, for instance, but it's got some constraints around it. Like the contract that you as a developer enter to use this API is quite strict, right? It says that, I think you can't go above 5% of usage of all Chrome users. So like the idea is like maybe Facebook couldn't get the API and then roll it out to every single user, and all of a sudden, like, I don't know, 11 billion different users starting to use this API. So the idea is like to constrain the growth of the API so that it doesn't go out of control. The other bit is that it's got these, you have to sign up for it as well, which is kind of really interesting. For a new API coming to the platform, you have to go and sign this kind of, it's not a contract or an agreement, it's the wrong way of saying it, but you have to put your details in. You get a key back, which is tied to your origin that says, this origin understands that this API is going to go away at some point. Like after 3 months, this API will either be taken off the platform completely, and then kind of, we'll work out a plan to actually scale it out, get it standardized, get it tested inside Chrome, and then try and roll it out kind of deliberately out to the web platform and out to the kind of all the users in that space. And this is what happened with the WebShare API. Is it was an origin trial. To use the WebShare API, you had to sign up, put your details of the origin that you're kind of trying to run the API on into a Google form. It's not kind of super like automated at this point. You get given a token back maybe the next day. You deploy this out, and then Chrome can kind of validate that token against the kind of list of approved sites that can use this API. And then you just basically use the API. And the idea is that the engineers behind this kind of API can then go and talk to those developers, like, what doesn't work? What do you need? Like, how should we improve it? Like, should we make any big significant changes? Like, does the API actually solve the problems that you want to try and do? And like WebShare was one of those things of where it's out there. It can only share text and URLs at the moment. And the first thing that a lot of people want to try and do is they want to share a full-on image, like a blob of an image, out into a native application. And like you technically can do it native app to native app. You can't do it with the WebShare API at the moment. But we've got that feedback because we've been able to kind of go out to a lot of developers and understand kind of their requirements and what they need and how we can then make the API better as well. So it's in like this backlog of prioritized things that we want to try and get out and done. And like we probably could have done that by releasing it like into Chrome and then having DevRel or a partner manager or someone else go out to a developer and kind of get more feedback. But it's been nice to kind of be able to kind of do lots of these different types of experiments roughly at the same time and be able to kind of work with the ecosystem, get the feedback, and then we pull them off the platform. So like with Twitter as an example, I think they launched it maybe a couple of days before the API got pulled out of Chrome. So like it doesn't work well for businesses, but that's the point, is like you're not supposed to rely on these APIs being around. Like they will sit there, you will be able to use them, and then we might ship them later on if we know it's a good API. So that's the origin trials thing, kind of in a relatively long-winded nutshell. So yeah.
So who can take part in origin trials? Is it do Chrome select companies or customers or kind of what's the story there?
You just you fill in the form. So like some of this is, we have like Blink, the engine behind Chrome has this process of like intent to implement, like intents basically, like we are going to implement this API and we're going to start working on it and shipping it, or we're going to deprecate this API and remove it from the platform. And they've got this idea of intent to experiment as well, as like, we think this API is useful. We want to get feedback from developers to make sure that the API, has got good developer ergonomics, but it actually solves the problem that we're trying to solve on the platform. So we start with that process, and then there's kind of some back-end kind of infrastructure that kind of makes it available to users if they've got the origin token. But the theory is any developer can go up to the form, put their origin in, you get a given token back, but you've got to deploy that token yourself onto your site. So you're kind of proving ownership of the fact that you own that site because you've put this kind of unique token into that page. So anyone can technically sign up. I don't think we've ever refused anyone kind of a token, but like there's not an automated process behind it. So there is a human there that does this at the moment. But yeah, anyone can sign up, but it's like, how do you know it exists? I think that's the other bit is, I did some of the stuff around navigator.share because I'm passionate about the API and I was describing how you should use it. So kind of people can pick up from that side of things. But like if you don't, like that's the thing is like, if you don't know that it's been shipped, then it could seem to be really hard to sign up and kind of discover this. But once you do, it's kind of open to anyone who owns the site, their own site, basically.
That's awesome. Is it just a Chrome thing, or are other browser vendors doing something similar?
I think when Alex Russell first talked about it, we got a broad swathe of support from other browser vendors. about kind of this model, and I'm trying to work out. I've not seen it in any other browser at the moment. I think a lot of people were waiting for us to see like how well it works and like how well we can shape APIs and get this feedback through. But right now, the thing is like you sign up for the token on our site, it's only for Chrome at this point. So it's not like you sign up and say Edge, for instance, say they supported the origin trial, like their own way of doing origin trials, like that token that you've got won't validate against Edge because like we're not all hooked up in the same process. I mean, that might be kind of interesting in the future, but I don't actually know whether the browser vendors are doing a similar thing. I think from our side, we've learned a lot in the process about some of these APIs. Some other APIs we've got very little feedback from as well. So like we need to tweak our process and learn from it a little bit more. But it feels like it's been quite successful.
So this sounds.
Yeah, that sounds.
No, go ahead, Leon.
Sorry, I was just going to say that it's, I think, a really good process because a lot of the criticism that JavaScript gets and a lot of other web APIs is that it's just, bolting on things after thing and fixing things that didn't quite work out the first time and those kind of things. So being able to do this initial research and really figure out kind of what a good starting point is for a particular API, I think it's something that's really needed. So it's great to hear that this is going on.
Yeah, I totally agree, Leon. I mean, it's a pretty agile process, and and being able to get that iterative feedback from developers seems like very useful in shaping the usage around the API as well as what the needs are. So I actually had a question regarding like can you give us like some examples of some successful features that have gone through origin trial and have made it all the way through and are real web specs now? And maybe a couple of examples of things that didn't make it.
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I actually think in the rundown that you did before, where it was the navigated share API and the USB API, I know Bluetooth as well. The Bluetooth API went through an origin trial and a number of iterations there. WebVR as well. I think that's been under an origin trial as well, and like that was because I think we knew that the API was going to change from version 1 to 1.1. I'm actually not sure whether it's come out of origin trial at the moment. So there's that. I'm trying to think of any APIs that have not come out the origin trial. I don't know. I think there's a new API that's come out at the moment called the Budget API. And the idea behind the Budget API is that you can send a push notification, and when you send a push notification today, you have to always, a push message, sorry, you always have to display a message, like a notification, to the user as a result of that message. And we've got a lot of feedback from developers that they want to be able to say in the morning at say 5 a.m., send a push message out to the user to download some content so that offline news articles or content is available, and do that in the background without having to show a notification, because notifications can be quite annoying for users at this point. Like if they get spammed and a whole bunch of other stuff, especially if it's not actually contextually relevant to them. So the idea behind the Budget API is, well, maybe we can send some push messages silently if we know that the user is engaged with the site. But you, as a developer, how do you know whether the user is engaged? Like, how do you know that you can still send a push notification silently and you don't have to show anything to the user in terms of net notifications? Like, how do you know how many you can send as well? Because as you send more messages, the idea is that your budget decreases, so that you can't all of a sudden send a push message every 10 minutes silently without displaying a notification. At some point, you're going to run out of money. It's the wrong word. You're going to run out of budget, and you must actually get the user to engage with your site again. So the Budget API itself is landed, I think, in Chrome Canary at the moment, 61, maybe 62, and it's behind an origin trial. But it's one of those ones where I think it's a relatively complex API to understand, and we don't know whether it's going to ship. So there's always that kind of potential of, that API might be pulled out if it's too complex and completely refactored and then never sent through. So I don't know whether that API is going to get pulled. I doubt it will. Maybe it will. Who knows? But this is the things that we need to get a lot of feedback and guidance from developers. And if it's too hard to use, then it probably won't land. So, yeah.
So roughly how long has the origin trials kind of been going on?
Oh my God, that's a good question. I think it's been about a year. I could find out, but I think it's been about a year. And I think Web Bluetooth was the first one that we put in behind an Origin trial at the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I was just wondering that, I don't know whether it's just me, but it seems like there's this huge explosion of really cool new web APIs that are just available every week, it seems to me. So do you think that could be because there's now this new process of being able to put things out there to get feedback without the risk of, things going horribly wrong? Do you think there could be a correlation between Origin trials and these new things going out a lot?
That's actually a really good question. I don't know. I mean, the Chrome kind of web platform team is relatively large and is able to create, a lot of new APIs that are coming through to solve a lot of the developer problems, right? And like one of our goals has been to kind of not necessarily try and be like a native application, but to enable kind of features that users would expect on their device or on their platform to their web applications at this point, or their websites. I think the team has put a lot of effort into making sure that we've got a full full life cycle of not a full life cycle. So we've covered a lot of the use cases of what a lot of developers care about. But I don't necessarily know whether it's new APIs are coming through quickly because Origin trials are there and it looks like it's coming through. Like the APIs do take a long time to get developed and pushed into the browser. Like I do remember the initiation of Web Bluetooth. I think it was 2 years ago that it was kind of like they started off development. It was like maybe a little bit longer. So like a lot of these APIs especially when they're dealing with kind of hardware access and everything, they've been probably in development or in consideration for quite a while. It's just that I think sometimes the culmination of this is like they're all now kind of getting to the point where they want to ship, they want to get out to developers. Is it the right API or not? I think is a question that we can start to answer with the Origin trials. I think the counterpoint to that, I'm not actually giving you a straight answer, I think, at the moment. I think the counterpoint to that, though, is that because it's not available on the web straight away, and we might have some APIs which we can probably develop rapidly, but we want to test out. Like we do get that flexibility to be able to do that. I don't think we're necessarily we're not using the Origin trial kind of framework and infrastructure to do that kind of let's ship anything that we can think of right now just because we've got this ability to turn it off. I don't think it's like that. I just think there's a lot of things that have been taking a long time to develop, and they're all starting to kind of come out roughly about the same time. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great answer. Can I add to your answer? Maybe give a less diplomatic answer, which is Leon. I think the web platform is the right platform. So I think the explosion is kind of really just like it's an exciting time to be in web, right? We have a lot of people from other technologies that are contributing to the web now, and I think it's just kind of pushing the envelope more with IoT and integrations and whatnot. But so the Mozilla Developer Network docs have a really good guide to web APIs. What I like is that and we'll link it in the show notes. They kind of list out all the different available APIs, and then they note which ones are deprecated, which ones are experimental and whatnot. So it's kind of a cool thing to be able to just at a snapshot see, what's available in my browser. So I guess to wrap up Origin trials, so how can developers get more involved? Where's the best place to go to learn about this? And if people want to pitch an idea, do they just go through the form, or what's the process for that?
Yeah, I think it comes from two angles, and Chris Wilson on our team is definitely able to articulate this way better than I can. There's these APIs that are we've been developing. We don't develop them without kind of some idea of a specification behind them. Obviously, it's not a standard at that point, but it's a specification about how these things should work. There's two bits. There's if you want to use one of the APIs that we're kind of working on, then there is. If we as a team have done our job right to some extent, you'll either find it on chromestatus.com, where you'll see all of the APIs kind of grouped by whether it's in development and which version of the Chrome it's landing in. We've got that. We've also got developers.google.com/web/updates, which is kind of like the transformation of HTML5 rocks into into kind of this newer site, I suppose, where we're able to maintain it a little bit better. So like we talk about new APIs that are coming through in there, about like how you can use them and where you can use them. And we try and use the infrastructure. Like if you submit a form, you include your email address to get the token for the origin trial. You include your email address, and we'll email you like once every I think maybe it's once a month. We'll email you to try and get more feedback through, so you can help us shape those APIs. If you have a new API to propose, and this is where like I know Chris Wilson in our team has got a lot of experience. I can never pronounce this right. It's either WCIG or YCG. Anyway, it's the kind of the incubation group in the W3C at the moment, and like the idea is that they're trying to kind of get to this place where they can foster new APIs coming through to the platform, and assess kind of whether other browser vendors are also interested in the same space. And if another browser vendor isn't kind of interested in the API, then there's probably a good chance it's not going to go through to an origin trial on our side, because it just means that we're going to ship something in Chrome, which we probably will end up having to remove because no other browser vendor is going to has any interest in, like in the long term, of actually supporting this API. So if you have ideas for new APIs, you can go to the YCG, and it's on GitHub as well. So there's a big GitHub repository where you can kind of submit these ideas and gauge kind of like the implementer, whether it's like, I won't say Apple, I can't quite recall. But definitely Microsoft, Mozilla, Chrome, they're all in this space of, trying to work out whether this is like it's a good idea, whether they can get more feedback, and whether they can then see whether they can start to kind of push this out to an origin trial in Chrome in particular on this side. So yeah, there's a kind of a W3C group that you don't necessarily have to sign up for, but you can participate on GitHub.
And we've talked about the incubator group before on the show. It seems to come up a lot more often these days, primarily because it seems the developers are much more engaged in the API, or engaged in providing feedback on the APIs they want on the platform. Because they're, to some extent, it does look like this explosion of things. We know how APIs work within the browser set, and that means that there was a lot of time that went into those things. Mm-hmm. As you start to gather those things, I'm sure you read the incubator group as I do and others. Do you see a lot of that feedback turn into actual hardline documentation? Because I see a lot of things that sort of pop up that some of them get kind of shoved away because people are like, no, we already tried that once. Or do you see a lot of rehashing of those things as APIs come in? I mean, obviously, I suspect you get even more of this even outside of the incubator group than most, as the person who often goes out amongst the DevRel community and talks to developers. I mean, are developers, do you see a lot of good ideas? Do you see a lot of bad ideas? Do you see just this is like people are very much engaged, or something a little bit different? I realize it's not really a good question, but hopefully that kind of made sense.
No, it's a fine question. I just don't think I know how to answer it. I think like Chris and the team are definitely more kind of, they know more about the process and whether things are working or not, and they've got a lot more history as well in terms of like how we've tried things in the past and everything. I think from my side of things, there's I tend to work on like an API basis to some extent. So APIs that I'm interested, things like navigator.share, I'll try and be an active participant on. But I think ultimately it's not necessarily the process which is the thing that you're working with. You're working with the people behind the API. Like these are like kind of, rather than suggesting a brand new API, it's more like I get involved in suggesting changes to existing APIs a little bit. And it's not necessarily the process, it's the people and how you work with the different engineers who are trying to trial this out and then trying to work out how you get adoption. And I think sometimes like you look at some things, I don't want to call out navigator.share, but the share API, it can't share images. It's a requested feature. And it's because it's really hard to do on Android. It's really hard to do well and really hard to do consistently. And there's a lot of we've got to just work with the people who are actually trying to implement these things, who are trying to get feedback. And like sometimes it is there a minimum viable API that you can ship that actually services most of most of the user requests and kind of the most of the initial use cases. And I look at navigator.share. It's like if you click on most of the buttons on the web for sharing things, they're not necessarily sharing images. They're sharing a little snippet of text, the title of the page, and a URL. And I think like that's the thing, is just like having some of that kind of reasoned debate and talking to the engineers and understanding kind of where they're coming from and what they can actually kind of physically implement in time, and like, you know, what is supported on the underlying platform as well. So I think that's a roundabout way of saying I don't quite know, but the experiences that I've had is it's all about how we just kind of articulate the kind of the questions that we have, and then trying to work with people a little bit more.
There definitely seems to be a segment. Like, you know, a lot of times we talk about primitives and bringing primitives to the web as a whole and saying, this is the low-level thing that you can now do, and now you build on top of that thing. And then there's the sort of sugared API side of life, which we all kind of realize that, you know, sugar is nice, but at the same time, it doesn't give you a lot of flexibility within that. You know, I think there is a fine line sometimes. I know that a lot of the APIs that I'm more interested in are those primitives, things that I can go and build on top of to do absolutely crazy things that normal people probably don't want to do. But admittedly, like, they give you the ability to stretch the platform in ways that, from a developer side of life, you're able to ship features you want on top of those platform primitives. And that's, you know, there's a lot around that. It's just,
yeah, I've actually got a question. What would you say is like, I look at things like Service Worker, where it's like, it feels like a fundamental primitive for the web platform that allows you to build a lot of additional functionality in. That presents problems to developers because not every developer wants to work out how to do offline and how to do caching or how to do stale whilst revalidate and a whole bunch of other stuff. But it allows us to create the tools and things in place, which I think Service Worker is a good example of kind of that primitive. Would you say things like the camera, like get use media, is a primitive, or whether it's one of those sugared APIs?
I think to me it's a primitive. And a couple of years ago I may have thought different, because I think time has sort of changed the scope of how people use things today. So, you know, camera stuff in terms of interaction and the way that we get to the low-level hardware ability of a camera now is much more something that I want from a developer standpoint, so that because to me, like, I can sugar the hell out of that on top of all the things that I would necessarily want to do with a particular camera for my particular use case of a thing.
Yeah.
Service Worker, I think, I agree. I think it's probably the easiest one to say, this is a pretty solid primitive. It's for some folks, it's pretty complicated because, again, yeah, you're right. They don't want to necessarily do that work, but then they have really nice tools on top. You know, Workbox, you know, as a prime example of something that is really nice on top of the primitive that gives people a really turnkey developer solution out of the gate. I think we'll see stuff around that for like things like camera. But you also bring up a fair point too, is that the web exists on top of existing platforms, and trying to integrate with those platforms can be a barrier to a lot of the APIs that we may want in terms of the way we operate things, whether that's things like generic storage. You know, I know this, I think Jake brought it up.
Yeah, he did, yeah.
Yeah, you know, and I'm all for that. Like, I want generic storage because we do a lot of things with big things, and I want to be able to write my own, you know, stack on top of that, on top of the primitive, but still make it available on the web. How readily available is that from a web API standpoint? Don't know. Like, at the end of the day, it still has to run on top of things. It has to run on top of Android, or it has to run on top of Windows, or wherever it may be. And I think that's pieces people have a tendency to forget. And I know we have shape detection on here, and I think that's actually a good kind of segue into shape detection, because shape detection is one of those things that a lot of people hear about in terms of augmented reality and AI and the things that we want to do. And there's hardware that supports that, but there's also software, and it's not going to quite work all the same across everywhere it is at the moment. And I think that kind of shows just how hard it is to develop and move the modern web forward, which is why it's so amazing where we are now as opposed to where we used to be, because we've gotten a lot, and a lot of people have done a lot of work to get us there in terms of spec and APIs and testing and failure and then rehashing. You know, a lot of quality has come out of that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't know how far you want to go into shape detection, but I think it's interesting. It's one of those ones where I think one of the things that you mentioned before was the camera API or service worker, like they're starting to expose more of the capabilities of the underlying platform to the developer so that they can control them. And like shape detection is one of those pieces where I think a lot like Qualcomm hardware and a bunch of other hardware has got like these algorithms and logic already built into the camera sensor and into the kind of the silicon and everything. And this is one of those examples of we're just trying to expose that to developers in the platform. But I worry about some of those APIs because like shape detection is like I don't know how consistent it's going to be across the platform, especially like if you're on, I don't know, a Chromebook. I'm pretty sure Chromebooks don't have face detection. I don't know, maybe they do, who knows. But like, how do you have that kind of consistency of like the different capabilities that the shape detection API offers? Like, how do we have that consistency so that if you run it across devices on the same browser, or you even run it across, I don't know, say Edge implements it, like do they implement it the same way so that you detect the same type of face and you can detect the same number of faces? So I don't know at the moment, and I think that's one of my worries about some of these, like bringing a lot of newer APIs to the platform. It's very hard to get consistency in terms of the implementation. It's very hard to rely on the API being there because of maybe Chrome is pushing the web forward very quickly at the moment in terms of capabilities, and a lot of other browsers vendors might not have the resources to catch up. So I kind of worry about that, and I've been thinking about whether, and sorry to kind of distract everything, is I've been trying to think about whether a lot of this code that exists for things like shape detection or other kind of APIs, it already exists in libraries that are I want to say C++ libraries or C libraries or whatever it is, and I actually wonder whether we can bring more of that just to the web as a software implementation, just purely through WebAssembly or some other things in that space as well. So
you read my mind. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, actually, particularly in relation to the shape detection API and trying to figure out the notion of polyfilling it where it's not going to go. Like, because I have a similar problem with shape detection and again, I'm using it pretty heavily at the moment for some stuff that we're working on as part of things. But having sort of written a polyfill around JavaScript implementations, because there exist lots of detection libraries for barcodes and faces and things of that nature. But with WebAssembly now, like, and the notion that C and C++ libs exist out there now, like, why not go that route? And I've started to actually go down that route for shape detection, particularly for barcodes, of which I don't quite have a working implementation at the moment. But a few, I know, it's I just couldn't do it in a day, right? But it is, again, the primitive sort of plays the big part. Is that with WebAssembly, which is pretty cool. We've talked about it on the show before. You can do quite a bit there, where you can write your own implementation and get the speed that you want and need, and not necessarily have to add it as a core attribute or a core API into the platform itself. For the reason you just mentioned.
And I think that gets to some of the primitive bit. It's like I kind of expect the camera to be an API that might be integrated into the platform because it's really hard to bridge out to native through anything else at the moment. But actually kind of functions on top of the data that's coming through on that API. You may or may not want to do in software. I don't quite know just yet, because face detection, barcode detection, that can be done in hardware, and I don't know how to bridge that just yet. But I was also thinking about just pure consistency, and I think like the interesting thing was like if Safari didn't ship, the way I was thinking about it is like if Safari didn't ship get user media in iOS 11, which they are, so it's kind of a moot point now. Was like I kind of want to get like, well, I want to be able to do more image processing. Actually, and the shape detection API is a good one. Is like I would like to be able to get the shape detection API working on Safari. They've got WebAssembly, so I could, in theory, kind of run that code there. And then I was thinking about, well, if Safari didn't have the get user media API, so you couldn't get an image, the only thing you could do probably for anything is maybe upload it through an file input, which you could probably do some analysis on. But then that's kind of cool. So you can do it in the client, and you can accelerate it with accelerate in the loosest possible term with WebAssembly. But then say you've got UC browser, which is incredibly popular in India, and we still want to get that same functionality. I'm pretty sure they don't have WebAssembly. Like, could you push that to the server at that point? So you've got Node.js, you can run the same module, and the same code, and the same algorithm, the same detection, and have that kind of like, I want to say progressive enhancement kind of way of doing it. But like you've got the functionality at every single stage of the kind of the web API or the web platform lifecycle. It's on the server first, so we can always run it wherever the user is and whoever the type of the device that the user has. You can run it on the client, and that's kind of cool. If we can do that, and then you could run it through hardware. And I'm trying to work out whether that's even a viable thing to try and do at the moment or push, or whether it's just like it's too early. We should just work with what we've got and then see where it goes. So I don't know. Sorry, I waffled a bit there. I think it's quite an interesting space.
No, it's a developing space, right? I don't think we necessarily have all the answers for it. I don't think they're readily available to us quite yet. But I think that kind of architecture you just described, to me, that makes sense. Like that's an architecture that I think I would arrive at as well, given a wide-spanning scope of stuff. But again, every developer is going to have that different use case, and consistency is going to be key. And consistency is sort of what made the web expand out to what we have today, to some extent, is that we did have for all its inconsistencies, that low friction, that ability to simply write and deploy, it gave us a lot of reach, and now we get to add nice things onto the API or core as we so please. Hopefully, consistency.
So I actually have a question about this like extensible web movement and bridging into hardware. So security, I think for me is like the biggest concern. I mean, obviously the web is incredible, but the web was like initially never really designed to be secure, right? Like users were supposed to trust each other back in the day. And like, you never thought someone was supposed to, it was never a system that was designed for people to harm each other, which is why it was built the way it was, right? And that's why internet security is like super difficult, right? The whole system wasn't architected with security in mind. And so I guess, can you talk a little bit about how security comes into play with all these new web APIs?
Maybe. I think that's an interesting space. Like a lot of the APIs do go through kind of like a security and privacy review before they get broadly shipped. I think there's an interesting model, and I think some discussion going on at the moment about what can we do in the web space to actually make sure that these APIs aren't abused for whether it's kind of tracking and kind of fingerprinting and a whole bunch of other stuff. Like that conversation kind of always happens at the spec groups, the spec level, that side of things. I think there's probably, I want to say there's better people to speak about it, definitely on that side of things. But I think the way that we're moving is that we want to make sure that we've got a pervasive permission model, so that the user opts in. Like you don't automatically get access to Bluetooth. I think this is one of the things that happened when the Bluetooth API launched. I think the way that we phrased one of the videos was allows you to discover the devices around you. And I think the lack of specificity in terms of our voice and tone caused some panic in terms of like, oh my, I don't want the web and this random website to be able to discover devices around me. And it's like, well, it's not like that. There's a permission model behind it. The user has to kind of have a user gesture. Then they see a kind of a prompt, and they never get access to all these devices and all this listing and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I feel like sometimes the web platform groups across all the browsers, they want to be secure. They want to be privacy conscious as possible when they're designing these APIs. And sometimes the messaging gets lost, I think, which is kind of my fault for I won't say our team, but like it's one of those things that we have to be quite careful about how we talk about these primitives to developers, because I think we are moving to this model of trying to lock things down a lot more, make sure that there's always a user gesture before some kind of experience happens, so it doesn't automatically happen on load, kind of give the user the control, the ability to kind of accept it, but also the ability to deny access to those APIs. So there is a permissions API inside Chrome. I don't know whether it's deployed in Firefox or not. But that gives you the ability to query the state of a permission, but it also gives you the developer or the user the ability to kind of revoke that permission in JavaScript as well. So we're kind of starting to get more and more of this kind of I do want to say a pervasive permissions model around a lot of this. And I've seen some kind of proposals for like, maybe we have to validate, and you have to, as a developer, prove that you control, or like you can control the JavaScript on the page, whether it's through CSP or whether it's through some kind of hash or fingerprint of like, this is the kind of the fingerprint of this JavaScript file. If it's changed, then maybe we don't want to run this API on the platform. So like there's lots of these different discussions about how to make sure that we are making sure that the users are secure, and the developers have all the kind of the tools and kind of their disposal to understand why, when, and how to do that as well. So I think that's an ongoing discussion. And people like Mike West on the team have got a lot of experience and kind of dealing with this space as well. So
I trust everybody on the internet.
Yeah, so do I. I give everyone my credit card information just so that it's I don't know what the problem is.
Oh, the internet used to be such a wholesome neighborhood.
Well, it really was. The internet was this open platform, right? And everyone was, you were just talking to your friends or or other people that were, cool enough to have, the technology that you also have across the world. And, which is why it's so hard to design, securely for the internet. It just was never a network that was meant to be secure, right? So it's just hard. But anyways.
So we're running up against time. What questions have we failed to ask, Paul, that we should have asked to round out the entire scope of modern web APIs? Because it's a topic that can be discussed in an hour fully, I think, and we probably missed some pieces.
So I'd like to know a little bit of detail on kind of how do browser vendors prioritize all these different APIs? Is it based on feedback they get from developers, or how do you decide what to do next?
Oh man, I wish I hadn't asked you to ask me that question. I think one of the things I was going to ask was like, I struggle to get feedback across, like from the entire ecosystem. Like the developer ecosystem is absolutely huge, and it's very hard to get a lot of kind of feedback in terms of what features we should build, what we should kind of prioritize on the platform. I think every single browser vendor does it differently. I look at how we did it once. I think Paul Irish tweeted out, how did he phrase it? I can't remember how he phrased it now, but like a while ago, he was like, what features do you need on the web platform to stop you from building a native application? It was in that frame. And I think like if you look back at that tweet, it's very clear about how we formulated what is now the progressive web app story, which is like developers wanted the ability to have experiences work offline, like you potentially get in native applications. They wanted to be able to get things onto the home screen installed and integrated with like in all the places that the users expect their applications to be. And then they want things like push notifications as well. And that was one way that we prioritize these things. Not every single API gets the same, is done the same way. I feel like the shape detection API is a good example of Miguel Casas, who's building that API. Like he comes from that background. He's got a huge amount of experience working with sensors and camera APIs and a whole bunch of other things that like this is a thing that he wants to prove out and show that you could solve. And then he went and tried to get kind of assess the demand for it from platforms. And like I think it'll vary from each different browser vendor about kind of what some of their priorities are. I always had this opinion that maybe like Apple's probably quite clear. They prioritize performance. They do prioritize. Everyone like prioritizes like privacy, but like you've seen some of the moves that they've been trying to make in terms of kind of I want to say content blocking, but like cookie blocking and a whole bunch of other stuff. And like they've all got different priorities about what their users want and what they want to kind of enable on the platform and that side of things as well. So I think it's really hard. I think things like the YCG or the WCAG, I can never remember how to say it, is a good way to kind of express the need for features that you might want and kind of get them like a rough design fleshed out. There's also things like Microsoft do where they use user voice to work out whether kind of APIs that they might be missing now from the platform that they should prioritize themselves. So yeah, I think everyone's different. I struggle with the prioritization, and I think just talking to developers is a good way of starting with some of that as well. So yeah.
Fantastic. Any other questions for Paul, Leon, Amal? Anything?
Thank you for such an awesome show. This is great.
Yeah, Paul, thanks for coming on the show. We know you're a busy man.
That's cool.
And you're
It's all good. I listen to it every week. Well, I can say every week, but every time it comes out. So you've already got a fan. So it's at least one person who's going to listen to it.
It's amazing.
I like my voice, so.
So,
well, thank you, Paul, so much for being on the show. Leon, Amal, any closing thoughts before we wrap up episode number 134?
Thank you. And then, are you based out of the London office for Google?
Yeah, so I'm in the London office. I'm in one of our little sound booths at the moment, and all the lights have gone off. So I'm technically based in the London office. I do a lot of work from Liverpool.
Awesome. And so how do people find you online? How do they connect with you on the interweb?
My blog, paul.kinlan.me, and my Twitter account, Paul_Kinlan. My Google email address is just paulkinlan@google.com. I say it's open. Obviously, it's secured. But feel free to ping me with any questions that you've got. I get a lot of things, so I don't always answer everything, but definitely feel free to reach out. So. Oh my god, that was the worst thing to say. Reach out. I hate the word reach out. Yeah, contact me. It's fine.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you for taking the time to come and talk to us about modern web APIs. It was a really good show. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this has been episode number 134 of the Web Platform Podcast. Tune in next week where 3 out of 4 web developers approve of the next API that someone comes up with. We have been your hosts, Justin Ribeiro, Amal Hassan, and Leon Revel. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you next week.